Before we proceed, I need to ask you this. How does a baby simply vanish? How does a child, as young, as vulnerable, as innocent as Emmanuel, disappear from the very people who were supposed to protect him? A baby cannot run away. A baby cannot hide. A baby cannot choose his fate. Someone had to know. Someone had to act. And yet, no one did. Now, sitting at the center of this case is Haro. In front of the court, he shakes his head at every accusation. He denies years of abuse, denies the bruises, denies the neglect, and instead defends the very mother so many believe turned a blind eye. To hear him speak, you'd think he was the one on trial for carrying the burden of truth. But the truth doesn't sit in the words of Haro. The truth sits in Emmanuel's silence. Because babies don't make up stories. Their wounds don't invent themselves. Their pain doesn't lie. And every time Haro opens his mouth to deny, to excuse, to shift blame, there's a child's cry that echoes louder than his words. So tonight we ask, if Haro is innocent, why does every detail of Emmanuel's life point to suffering? And more importantly, where is baby Emmanuel now? Before we dive any deeper into this case, let me pause for just a moment. Shadow Detective isn't just another true crime channel. It's a community that refuses to look away when justice is at stake. If you believe that truth matters, if you believe that every victim deserves a voice, then I'm asking you to stand with us. Subscribe now and become part of a movement that pushes back against silence. And while you're here, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because justice has no borders, and together, no matter where we are, we make sure the world never forgets. Darkness has a way of swallowing the most vulnerable, and in this case, the darkness has a name, Emmanuel. A baby who should have been cradled, protected, and loved, yet instead he is missing. His voice stolen, his story fractured, and his future uncertain. At the center of it all sits Haro. In the courtroom, his voice is steady, not with grief, but with denial. He rejects the accusations of long-term abuse, shrugs off the signs of suffering, and places his energy not in finding Emmanuel, but in protecting himself and the mother. That is the contradiction that chills this entire investigation. A missing child on one hand, and on the other, an accused man more concerned with reputation than revelation. The trail of evidence is broken, scattered, and incomplete, but what remains paints a picture of neglect, of harm, of silence. As a detective, the question isn't simply what happened to Emmanuel. The real question cuts deeper. Why is every adult in his life more focused on clearing their own name than protecting his? Because justice isn't found in denial. It's found in truth, and the truth has no reason to hide. Emmanuel wasn't a headline. He wasn't a statistic. He was a baby. Small, fragile, defenseless. At his age, survival depended entirely on the adults around him. He couldn't speak for himself. He couldn't protect himself. Every bruise, every mark, every sign of neglect was a silent scream the world failed to hear. Reports tell us Emmanuel showed signs of malnutrition. His body carried bruises no baby should bear. His short life was already marked with suffering. And yet, in every official statement, we hear more about Haro's denials than we do about Emmanuel's pain. That's the contrast that should haunt us. On one side, a child whose entire existence was fragile and fleeting. On the other, an accused man fighting desperately to preserve his own name. When we talk about missing persons, we talk about lives interrupted. But when it's a baby, we're talking about a life that barely even began. Emmanuel never got the chance to grow, to run, to laugh freely. And that is why this case is not just another investigation. It is an indictment of how easily the smallest among us can be forgotten. Now let's turn to Haro, not as the father figure he pretends to be, but as the accused sitting behind bars. Inside custody, Haro has been kept under strict watch, segregated, monitored, and marked as high risk. Some say it's for his own protection. But the question we must ask is, protection from what? From fellow inmates? From the public outrage? Because Emmanuel never had that luxury. Behind bars, Haro receives what every inmate is guaranteed, 3 meals a day, a bed to sleep in, walls to shield him from harm. The irony is brutal. Emmanuel, a baby, had none of those guarantees. No protection, no safety, not even the basic assurance of survival. In the courtroom, Haro's appearance tells its own story. Some days, defiant. Other days, calculatedly calm, almost rehearsed, like a man who knows how to play sympathy, how to shift eyes away from the child, who can't speak for himself. He walks in, shackled but still breathing. Emmanuel, the victim, may not even be alive to walk anywhere again. And that's where the guilt cuts deepest. Because while the system bends over backwards to ensure Jake Haro's rights are protected, Emmanuel's rights, the right to life, the right to safety, the right to be loved, were stripped away before he even learned how to walk. So we must ask, is the system protecting Jake Haro more than it ever protected Emmanuel? The courtroom has its own kind of theater. Wooden benches, polished floors, and the weight of silence that falls when the accused enters. But in the case of Jake Haro, that silence wasn't respect, it was tension. Jake walked in with the posture of a man rehearsed, his body language carefully measured, eyes darting only when pressed, jaw set tight, shoulders squared as if trying to appear unbroken. His defense painted him as misunderstood, insisting there was no long-term abuse, no lasting harm, and that the mother was innocent. But every word was a sharp contrast to the faces in the gallery. Family members sat still, some hollowed by grief, others tight with rage. One glance from them carried more truth than pages of legal argument. Because while Jake's lawyer spoke of lack of evidence and reasonable doubt, Emmanuel's absence was the loudest testimony in the room. There were moments when the silence itself felt like a verdict. A pause too long after a statement, a shifting of feet when Emmanuel's name was spoken. And then there were the outbursts, quiet gasps, muffled sobs, human reactions in a place where justice often feels mechanical. And that's the tragedy. Courtrooms are built to weigh evidence, but in cases like this, sometimes they only weigh excuses. Legal theatrics fill the air with arguments, but Emmanuel's reality, the bruises, the hunger, the missing life, can't be cross-examined. It just lingers, heavy, undeniable, and ignored in favor of procedure. When Jake Haro finally spoke, his words were drenched in denial. He didn't waver. He didn't hesitate. He claimed there was no long-term abuse, no pattern of harm. He insisted that Emmanuel's mother was innocent, that she was being unfairly blamed, that the world was twisting their story. But here's the truth about words. They're cheap when stacked against reality. Records show prior concerns. Child Protective Services had already been on alert. Reports of bruises, whispers of neglect, and moments where intervention could have happened but didn't. Photographs and testimonies reveal what Jake's words attempt to bury. Emmanuel's fragile body bore visible marks of suffering. Jake says there was no abuse. The evidence says otherwise. Jake insists the mother's hands are clean. The reports say she stood by as the baby weakened. Jake wants us to believe his version. But Emmanuel's silence, his absence, his tiny broken trail of existence, tells a different story altogether. Every denial is a wall, but walls can't cover the truth forever. They may stand for a time, but truth has a way of cracking through the lies, brick by brick. And when it does, Jake Haro's words won't protect him. They'll condemn him. To understand the weight of Jake Haro's denials, we have to step back and look at the trail he left behind. Because violence rarely appears out of nowhere. It builds, it escalates, and it leaves warning signs along the way. Jake Haro was no stranger to anger. There were whispers about his temper, accounts of neglect, and behavior that raised questions long before Emmanuel ever went missing. Prior concerns had been documented. Emmanuel's bruises were noticed. His frail body told a story nobody wanted to hear. And yet those red flags weren't treated as alarms. They were treated as paperwork. Authorities had opportunities to act, but instead of intervention, there was silence. Instead of removing a child from danger, there were just notes in a file, visits logged, and then forgotten. Emmanuel's pain became a statistic in a system already overwhelmed. This isn't just about Jake Haro's history, it's about the history of failure that surrounded Emmanuel. Because if a baby shows up with bruises, that should not be a footnote in a report, it should be a red siren. But here it was ignored. And in that silence, in that negligence, Emmanuel's suffering was allowed to continue. The system that should have been his shield became a sieve, letting every cry for help slip through. And now we're left asking, how many chances were missed to save him before it was too late? When we look beyond Jake Haro, we see a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. The system that was supposed to protect Emmanuel failed him long before Jake ever stepped into a courtroom. There were warning calls, there were signs of neglect, there were reports that should have sparked immediate action. Yet time and again, Emmanuel was left in the very environment that endangered him. Why weak sentencing? Probation slaps on the wrist, caseworkers stretched too thin or unwilling to dig deeper. And somewhere between the paperwork and the hearings, Emmanuel's cries were lost. And now, only after his disappearance, do we hear the outrage. Headlines scream, comment sections fill with fury. Neighbors whisper, how could this happen? Some in the media demand accountability, while others tiptoe around the story, afraid to say too much. But the harshest truth cuts through all of it. Everyone says justice for Emmanuel's now. But where was justice when he needed it most? Where were the urgent voices when he was showing up with bruises? Where was the system when his tiny body bore the weight of neglect? This isn't just one man's crime, it's the failure of every hand that should have intervened and didn't. The courtroom is now the stage for outrage, but the real story is written in silence, hesitation, and neglect. And here we arrive at the most haunting part of all, the piece that's still missing. Emmanuel, after all the denials, the courtroom sparring, the reports of bruises, the debates about who knew what, one thing has never changed. Emmanuel has not been found. His crib is still empty. His laughter, if he ever had the chance to laugh freely, has been silenced. His story has no closure. Families who lose a child often say that even grief is better than uncertainty, because grief has an endpoint. But here there is only silence. An open wound that refuses to heal. And in that silence, speculation thrives. Neighbors whisper, strangers online dissect the case. Rumors grow legs, but Emmanuel himself, the baby at the center of it all, is forgotten in the noise. Yes, there was talk of a reward, a sum of money meant to buy answers. But what does it say about us, about society, when a child's worth is reduced to a dollar sign? Shouldn't the very fact that Emmanuel is missing be enough to move someone to speak? And yet, the silence stretches on. Law enforcement shields details, promising it protects the integrity of the investigation. But tell me, who protected Emmanuel before he vanished? Whose integrity was safeguarded then? Because from where I stand, it feels as though the system has been more careful with its paperwork than with the life of a child. And this is the thought that stalks every detective who's ever stood in front of a missing child's empty bedroom. When a child disappears, the silence left behind is louder than any denial, any defense, any courtroom performance. Because in the end, the lawyers get to go home. Jake Haro gets to sit in his cell. The public gets to move on to the next headline. But Emmanuel doesn't get to move on at all. So here we are. The hearings come and go. The headlines fade. Jake Haro can spin his story, defend the mother, and deny abuse until his last breath. The system can file its motions, stamp its papers, and move at the speed of bureaucracy. The public can argue, point fingers, or even forget. But Emmanuel? He can't speak. He can't defend himself. He can't deny, or explain, or beg for another chance. His entire life, every ounce of innocence, every fragile breath, was entrusted to the very people who now stand accused of breaking him. And that is the cruelest contrast of all. Because the courtroom can move on, but Emmanuel never will. The parents can insist on their innocence, but Emmanuel's bruises can't be cross-examined away. The system can say it's protecting the investigation, but who protected Emmanuel before the investigation ever began? That's the truth that should keep us awake. Not just what happened to Emmanuel, but how so many chances to save him were missed. And until someone breaks the silence, until someone puts Emmanuel's name above their own excuses, this case will remain exactly what it is. A scar on every adult who looked away, and a haunting question mark where a baby's life should have been. Justice isn't a word for courtrooms. Justice is a promise to the voiceless. And Emmanuel, he's still waiting. Before we close tonight, I need to say this. Justice doesn't just live in courtrooms. It lives in people who refuse to look away. If you believe Emmanuel deserves more than silence, if you believe children like him should never be forgotten, then join us. Subscribe to Shadow Detective, and be part of a community that refuses to stop asking the hardest question of all. But why? Because every view, every comment, every share keeps Emmanuel's name alive when others would rather bury it. And as you subscribe, drop in the comments where you're watching from. Let the world see how far Emmanuel's story reaches. Let his name echo louder than the excuses that tried to erase him. Here we don't move on until the truth is found. We don't stop until justice has a voice. This is Shadow Detective, and Emmanuel still matters.